they are going to write all of it down. Not to bury you, to save you. That is the part nobody warns you about. You live in a village of stone and mud in what is now western New Mexico. You were born male. You will spend your life doing what the women of your village do, grinding, weaving, shaping clay, carrying water, and your neighbors will not find this strange, because your role has a name, and the name is older than anyone alive. You will be photographed more than almost any native person of your century. Your pots will end up in a national museum. You will shake the hand of a president. And in 130 years, when someone finally writes the definitive book about you, an old couple in your own village will hear about it and laugh. Here is the thing about this channel's usual promise. We say it a lot. We have always existed. The records just got burned. Burned, lost, eaten by damp, thrown out by a nephew who needed the shelf space. That is the normal shape of it. You go looking for a queer life in the archive and you find a hole. Not here. This time, the archive is enormous. This time, there are photographs, museum accessions, government letters, a 328-page book, and a president. There is more paper about this one person than about entire villages. Walter Williams, writing in the American Indian Culture and Research Journal in 1991, could summarize your entire recorded life in about 4 paragraphs. The trip, the pottery, the jail, the funeral, and every fact in it was put on the page by somebody who was not you. And the person is still gone. That is the mechanism I want to hand you today, and it is not the one you are expecting. You can erase someone by writing too much about them. Not by silence, by volume, by everybody grabbing the pen at once, each one needing you to mean something slightly different, until the pile of meanings is taller than you are and nobody can see over it. Nobody in that pile is lying, exactly. That is what makes it work. Your role has a Zuni word. The anthropologist wrote it down as Lhamana. Walter Williams, in the American Indian Culture and Research Journal in 1991, put it plainly. Such males, he wrote, were accepted as Lhamana, the Zuni word for the Berdache gender role. Hold on to that sentence, because 2 of its words are already a problem. The first is Berdache. That was the standard anthropological term for most of a century. And it is not a Zuni word, and it is not a neutral one. Will Roscoe, the man who wrote the big book about you, spelled out where it came from, in the notes to an article in GLQ in 1995? The term, he wrote, is seen as retaining its European sense of slave boy and catamite. And then, Native Americans are understandably offended by labeling a role that is largely religious in nature with terminology whose original meaning was sexual. So, a religious role, named by outsiders after a sex act. For about 100 years, in the literature, on purpose. The replacement, Two-Spirit, arrived in the late 1980s. Roscoe dates it to the Minneapolis organization American Indian Lesbians and Gays, who took it up as a pan-tribal term. It is a literal translation of an Anishinaabe word, which means the word most people now reach for to describe a Zuni person is a translation of an Ojibwe word, adopted in Minnesota in the 1980s. That is not a gotcha. It is just what happened. The second problem word is the spelling itself, and this is where I have to stop and tell you something. Every Zuni word in this episode reached me through anthropologists. The spelling on your screen is theirs, not Zuni orthography. I read Roscoe's article in a scanned PDF, and the scan mangles exactly those letters. The Zuni terms come out garbled in the digital text. I am confident about what the words mean, because I can read the full paragraph around them. I am not confident about how they are spelled, and I am not going to perform confidence I do not have by putting a tidy italicized glossary on the screen. A listicle would print the glossary. The glossary looks great. The glossary is the whole aesthetic of knowing things. I will show you the words. I will also tell you that the letters pass through a machine that eats them. Now the part everyone tells. In 1885, and hold that year loosely, I will come back to it. A pioneer anthropologist named Matilda Coxe Stevenson was impressed enough by your pottery and your weaving that she brought you to Washington. D.C. Williams describes it as a 6-month visit. 6 months. You were photographed by Smithsonian photographers while you demonstrated Zuni craftwork. Your art is in the Smithsonian collections today, and in Washington society, in Williams's words, you were accepted as a Zuni princess. You passed as a woman in Washington social circles, and, with Stevenson's assistance, you were quite a hit with the political elite. Note his quotation marks. They are doing work. Zuni does not have princesses. Zuni is matrilineal and matrilocal in the account Roscoe assembled. As his reviewer describes it, women own their own houses and their own food stores, and children belong to the mother. That is not a monarchy. It has no princess-shaped hole in it. Zuni princess was not something you were. It was something Washington needed so that it could enjoy you without having to think about you. A princess is a fairy tale a capital city tells itself so it can be charmed by a person it is currently governing. And here is the part that the princess story eats, so I am going to say it before the charming version gets a chance. You were working. Williams notes that Roscoe points out something the anecdotes leave out. Your sale of pottery and textiles created an important economic base for Zuni artisans in the 20th century. Read that as a sentence about money, because it is one. You went east as a craftsperson with a product. You demonstrated that product to the people with the buying power, and the market you opened outlived you by 100 years. Zuni artisans were still eating off that market when the anthropologists who described you were dead. That is not a princess. That is a trade delegation of one. And you were a hit. Genuinely. The parties, the photographs, the audience with the President of the United States Williams writes that you even had an audience with President Grover Cleveland. Here is my second refusal, and it is about that sentence. I cannot give you a year for the Cleveland meeting. Nobody can, as far as I can find. Williams says the audience happened. He does not date it. The National Archives teaching page says the Washington visit was 1886. A Washington history blog says you arrived in December of 1885. The peer-reviewed review says 1885 and 6 months, which would spill you neatly across both years and explain how two different numbers can both feel right and neither can be checked. So, I am not going to read you a date in a confident voice over a picture of the White House. The number that gets repeated most is not the number that got verified most. It is just the one that fit in the caption first. 7 years later. The United States government, the one that had you to tea, sent an army officer into your village to interfere in Zuni witchcraft trials. In Roscoe's reconstruction, witchcraft accusation was Zuni's main crime control mechanism. The fear of it, he argues, kept people cooperative. Roscoe's reading, and it is a reading, is that the successful stayed humble for fear of envy, and the unsuccessful swallowed their resentment for fear of the charge. You defended it. Williams again, and I am quoting his sentence because the verb matters. Wewha bodily threw the investigating United States Army officer out of the house of the Zuni governor and barricaded the door. Threw, out of the house. And then barricaded the door. For that, you spent a month in jail. Williams adds one line that I have not been able to stop thinking about. Though dressed in women's clothes, Wewha was recognized by the Zuni as the strongest person in the pueblo. I want to be careful with that sentence, because it is the kind of line that gets clipped and captioned and turned into a poster. Do not make this a triumph beat. The same institution that received you as a princess in its capital sent a man with a badge into your governor's house and then put you in a cell for a month. That is not a contradiction that needs resolving. That is one policy with two faces, and the charming face and the jailing face were funded by the same budget. Officials of that era, Williams notes, complained in writing about sexual immorality in Zuni ceremonies, in the antics of the sacred clown dancers, and in the social acceptance of the Berdache. They liked you at the party. They did not intend to let you exist at home. In 1896, after overworking yourself preparing for a major Zuni ceremonial, you died of heart failure. Williams writes that your death caused universal regret in the pueblo, and then more accusations, and more army intervention. And Roscoe's argument, his, not mine, and it is an interpretation, is that with witchcraft trials suppressed after 1896, the Zuni were left, in Williams's summary, feeling defenseless. Now the part almost nobody tells, and it is the best documented thing in this entire episode. In 1991, Will Roscoe published The Zuni Man-Woman. It won attention, it won praise, and it is still the book about you. It is the reason most people have heard your name at all. Walter Williams reviewed it, warmly, and in the middle of the warmth he put this: unfortunately, Roscoe did not do intensive fieldwork at Zuni. Read that again. The definitive book about a Zuni person, the one that made your name legible to the outside world, was assembled, in the judgment of a sympathetic reviewer, in a peer-reviewed journal, without intensive fieldwork in your village. That is refusal number 3, and it is not mine. It is Williams's, in print, in 1991. I am just declining to leave it out of the summary. Williams also would not take Roscoe's central label. I dislike Roscoe's use of the hierarchical third gender label. He wrote right there in a review that otherwise calls the book a significant contribution. 2 scholars, same evidence, same decade, and they cannot agree what to call you. I am not going to pick for you. That disagreement is real, and it is on the page. And the tidy one-word answer that a thumbnail wants does not exist in the literature it claims to be summarizing. And then, 1995. Roscoe goes back to Zuni. He writes it up himself, in GLQ, and this is the passage. With a friend interpreting, I had asked an elderly couple some questions about Wewha that have come up since the Zuni man-woman was published. Their immediate response was, "Why is he asking that? Didn't he write a book about it?" And then Roscoe's next sentence. This was followed by gales of Zuni laughter. That is the whole thing. That is the episode. The expert came back to the village to ask the people the questions his book had already answered, and the village laughed at him. Not bitterly. Roscoe reports it as a joke, and he prints it against himself, which credit where it is due most people would have cut. The same article opens with a Zuni elder named Alex Wewha, a man who had been painting Kachina murals in the old mission for 20 years, pausing and asking Roscoe, "Tell me, do you think that Wewha was a homosexual?" Sit with the direction of that question. The Zuni elder is asking the white anthropologist what the Zuni ancestor was. Not because he does not know his own village. Because the question itself is an import it arrived from outside, it got asked about you for a century, and now it is being handed back to the man who carried it in, like a package delivered to the wrong address and returned to sender. Roscoe, to his credit again, sees it. He writes that when he lectures at Zuni, he tries to avoid using Western terms for figures like you. But there I was, he writes, being invited to do just that, to interpret a Zuni tradition from a Western perspective. Here is the myth this episode exists to break. The story everyone tells about roles like yours is that colonialism came and the tradition died. Missionaries, boarding schools, shame, silence, gone. A clean tragedy with a start and a finish. Roscoe's 1995 article is 30 pages of arguing that this model is wrong, and his evidence is a word. In 1987, he was told the traditional Zuni term was still in use for historical figures like you, and that a new term had been coined for homosexual. By 1993, 6 years, it had all moved. A different term, girl boy, was being used for men understood as traditional two-spirits, while the old word had slid over to mean gay. The word did not die. The word got reassigned. Twice, in 6 years. While the anthropologists were still arguing about what it had meant in 1896, that is not a culture emptying out. That is a culture doing what living cultures do to their vocabulary, which is use it. The tradition was never a museum piece waiting to be rescued by a book. It was in the mouths of people who kept finding new work for it, and who found the question of what it really meant funny enough to laugh at a visiting expert about. And the role was not new when the missionaries showed up either. Williams notes that Roscoe cites archaeological evidence he gives the pages 24 and 25 indicating the tradition is an ancient one in native North America. Older than the word Berdache. Older than the United States. Considerably older than the opinion of the officer at your governor's door. Which is what makes the ending of the standard story so convenient for the people who tell it. If the tradition died on contact, then contact is the last interesting thing that ever happened to you, and the century since is somebody else's chapter. That is a tidy arrangement. It is tidy for exactly one side, and the pronoun. Since I have spent this whole episode on other people's words for you, I owe you honesty about mine. Williams, in 1991, calls you he all the way through. Common practice now is she. In everything I could read for this episode, no Zuni voice in print settles it. So when I say she, understand, that is a choice I made by a stranger, from the same distance as everyone else in this story. It is not a finding. It is the 5th outsider in a row picking a word for you, and I am not going to dress that up as research. I want to do one more thing before the end, and it is the least comfortable one, because it applies to me too. Roscoe's book closes by making an argument about us. Williams quotes it with page numbers so I can hand you the actual sentences. Roscoe asks whether men and women today can ever achieve mutuality and wholeness as long as men who manifest qualities considered feminine, and women who do the same in male realms, are seen as deviants to be criminalized and stigmatized. And he concludes that the role you filled offers a model of gender reconciliation that Western societies can no longer afford to ignore. That is a generous, humane paragraph. I do not think it is wrong. I also notice what it does. It ends the book about a Zuni person with a lesson for Western society. You spent a month in a cell for barricading a door, and a century later the takeaway is what your life can do for the people whose government held the key. Even the sympathetic account, the careful one, the one that made you visible, finishes by putting you to work on somebody else's problem. Williams quotes one more line from page 214, and this one I find harder to shake. The role, Roscoe writes, ensured the representatives of diversity a place in the middle as valued participants. A place in the middle. Valued participants. That was your village's arrangement, and it worked. And then people who had no such arrangement came to look at it and wrote it down and took it home and argued about it for 100 years. So let us count what we have. Matilda Coxe Stevenson needed an informant and a companion and a marvel to bring home. Washington needed a princess. Ruth Benedict Roscoe writes that she was so impressed by the